Tomato seed saving is one of my favorite topics, and as you can see, I love growing tomato plants. But why would I bother saving my own seeds? It is self-sufficient and money-saving to save your own seeds. You don't have to rely on buying them from a seed company year after year. Also, it's a good idea to maintain the genetic diversity from our ancestors. If we don't keep those varieties going, they could become extinct and lost forever. We need that genetic material so we can breed new varieties for future use. The last reason, and maybe the most important, is that we can select for our local climate. I want seeds that are adapted to my climate pressures and disease pressures. Now, I live in Zone 4, and my needs are very different from a grower in Zone 8. So next we want to acquire some ripe fruit to start saving the seeds. So we're going to go ahead and walk through my rows of tomatoes looking for some ripe fruit. So I have a variety in mind that I specifically want to seed save first, and this variety is called Aunt Lou's Underground Railroad. So I have my bowl, and I'm going to be selecting some fruit that are already fallen on the ground, kind of like windfall apples, because I don't want to use the fruit that's on the vine, because I want to save that for eating. Also, by using the ones that are already on the ground, they're already starting to mold, and this will just speed up the fermentation process. So come on into the row here, and we'll be selecting the ones on the ground. Remember, we're not going to be eating them, so they are going to be rotten already. That's just exactly what we want. The reason I'm selecting this variety, Aunt Lou's Underground Railroad, is because it really does a phenomenal job growing in my zone. So I want to use this for breeding new varieties next year and crossing this with something else. I'm on the opposite side of the Florida weave system that I use, so I can find some more of these Aunt Lou's Underground Railroad. Here's a good one here. Now this one is too rotten that I really don't care to bring that in the house, so some of them I will leave. Oops. So I can certainly go and continue hunting down the rows looking for more of this variety, but I'm actually going to grab a different bowl and start getting some additional varieties. The next variety that I've selected to seed save from is a plant called Early Sabacus aliana. Now this variety, I like it for several reasons. It's early and it has a very long shelf life. And of course the flavor and texture is very smooth and mild, so it's something that I would like to breed with in the future, mainly for its earliness. So we're going to grab my bowl and go ahead and select some of these. Now I'm going to be selecting ones that are kind of in the dirt already, so I'm not sacrificing again so much of my food crop. So you can see this is a really pretty yellow, kind of egg-shaped cherry tomato. The texture is very smooth. And like I said, this is one of the most early varieties that I grow here in my Minnesota garden. So this is a very desirable trait considering the very short growing season that we have here. Now you want to save seed from fruit that is very ripe. Another thing that I wanted to mention is that to maintain proper genetic diversity, for a tomato, which is considered an inbreeding plant, you should be saving from 20 plants versus an outbreeding plant like squash, you would want to save from 100 plants. Now, realistically, I know that that's not feasible for the majority of people. But do try to save from several plants as best as you can. And what I mean by that is that an inbreeding plant, like a tomato, has both the male and female parts in the blossom, so it pollinates itself. The anther cone, which is the male, is providing pollen onto the stigma, which is the female part. Versus squash blossoms, the flowers are male and female and separate, and they're going to get pollen from a different plant pollinating it. So if you zoom in close here, you can see that I'm just taking the ones off of the ground. I think this is a good amount for seed saving right here, so we'll just end with this. So we've harvested a bunch of tomatoes. Some of them we'll be using for making tomato sauce, and some of them will be for seed saving. So the next step in tomato seed saving is we need to get the seeds out of the tomatoes and into a container. I like to be thrifty and just reuse food containers. They can be washed and reused repeatedly. And also you don't want to use nice containers because we'll be fermenting the tomatoes in these containers. So what I like to do is use a piece of masking tape and just label it with a pen on the masking tape. That way I can peel this off, and when I'm transferring the seeds on a plate to dry them, I can stick the label on that. Also, by removing this, I can rewash this container and reuse it repeatedly. So these are the varieties that I'll be seed saving for today. I do have them pre-labeled, so we're going to get busy cutting them in half right now. We're going to start with the Aunt Lou's Underground Railroad, which I just picked recently. So let's take this over to the sink. You'll need a cutting board and a knife. You also need a bowl for putting the compost in. And of course your labeled container. So you want to cut the tomato horizontally. And you're going to give the tomato a squeeze into the container. Getting all the seeds out, but you really don't need to get much of the pulp out of there. So try to just get mostly the seeds, use your fingers. Okay, and then we're going to set that aside. If you wash these tomatoes ahead of time, you can still use them for your sauce making. But these I just picked up off the ground, and some of them are half rotten already. So these are deliberately for the seed saving. Otherwise you could feed them to chickens, etc. Okay. This is pretty messy, so I do recommend wearing an apron. So again, I cut that horizontally, and we're going to give that a squeeze. Now, different varieties are obviously going to be either very watery and juicy, or some of the paste varieties are very meaty and not juicy. So that's going to affect how easy it is to squeeze it out. This is a really easy one. I really like this variety, Aunt Lou's Underground Railroad, because it really performs well in my area. So I do intend to use this for some breeding in the future. Remember that one of the purposes of seed saving is to adapt to your local climate and conditions. So I just finished chopping up the Aunt Lou's, and this is what it looks like in the container. The next step is add a very small amount of water. Now, one mistake I see people make is they add too much water. We just want to add a very small amount of water, just enough to mix this up. So taking it over to the sink. Now this container did get a little full. You can do more than one container, obviously. But I'm just going to stir this up with my hands. I kind of want to break up the chunks of pulp that got in here. So give this a little stir. The reason you don't want to add too much water is that it's just going to slow down the fermentation process. And also I don't want the seeds to germinate either. So this is good here, and this is ready to sit outside so it can ferment. Let's do a couple more examples of other tomato varieties so you can see what that looks like. One point I do want to mention here is that as you're switching to doing another tomato variety, you want to make sure that you wash off your knife and your cutting board, because you could accidentally have a stray tomato seed on the knife and you could get your varieties mixed up. So you definitely don't want to do that. So I'm just going to rinse everything off in my sink. I wouldn't want to accidentally have an Aunt Lou's Underground Railroad tomato seed getting mixed in with a green zebra, for example. So we want to avoid any cross-contamination. Okay, so what variety do we want to do next? Let's do an example of a pear-shaped tomato. So we're going to do Cafe Buell. This is a small pear-shaped cherry that's kind of a deep orangey red color. A really fun variety. I'm just going to dump these on the counter. So with the pear-shaped, you actually want to cut horizontally on the bulbous area, because the seed cavity will be down below here, like that. You want to think of it like a butternut squash. When you're cooking a butternut squash, all the seeds are in that bulbous lower cavity. So you're going to go ahead and cut all of those horizontally in that fashion. And we're going to get busy squeezing. Obviously with the cherry tomatoes, the seeds are a lot smaller. And as we move on to our currant tomato, those seeds will be even smaller yet, but more numerous. So I will meet you back here when we're finished with this one. So I just finished doing the Cafe Buell seed extraction. And this is what it looks like without the water added. It's pretty watery. So again, I'm going to add just a small amount of water. Okay, we're going to give that a stir. And that looks good. So these will be going outside for the fermentation process. Let's do one more example. I want to show you a variety of a currant tomato. I got a nice collection here of 4 currant tomatoes. I have Coyote, Ted's Pink Currant, an Orange Currant, and Matt's Wild Cherry. Let's go ahead and do Matt's Wild Cherry. So you can see what it looks like doing these extra small varieties. So these, they are a little more tedious, obviously, to cut in half. You can just take the whole thing and squeeze it like that, but it is rather messy and it's going to squirt everywhere. So I actually do take the time to have them horizontally, just like I would a large tomato. I've seen some people put them in like a food processor or a blender to speed it up. And the seeds are small enough that you could probably do that without damaging them. Similar to Mexican sour gherkins, for example. So that would be an option as well. Just experiment and do what works for you. So you can see how tiny they are. So let's talk about the fermentation process. Why is it necessary to ferment tomato seeds? Well, if you look closely at each seed, you can see that they're surrounded in a gelatinous sac. Much like a cucumber seed, if you ever look at your cucumber seeds, it's the same thing. Well, that gelatinous sac has chemicals that inhibit the germination process. And that's great when you want to eat the fruit. I mean, heaven forbid you would want it to germinate in a fresh fruit that you want to eat. But when we want to grow the seeds, we don't want that inhibition. So we need to remove that gelatinous sac. And the fermentation process will do that for us. Basically, we're mimicking nature. At the end of the season, when the fruit would fall to the ground, it's going to start rotting. Another bonus is that the fermentation process will destroy the seed-borne illnesses. So continue on with all these currant tomatoes, and I will meet you back when I'm finished. So I just finished the Matt's Wild Cherry into the cup here. And remember, I didn't start with that many fruit. And look how many seeds you can get out of a very small amount of fruit. So again, we're going to add just a small amount of water. Give that a little stir. And that is going to sit for fermentation. So I have quite a few more varieties that I'll be doing today yet, but I'll be taking all of these containers and putting them outside in a shed to ferment. Now, on average, it can take about 3 days, and this is going to depend on the temperature and the humidity. So if it's summertime, it could be as fast as 2 days for me, where I live in Minnesota. If I'm doing this in October, I may be smarter to actually do it in the house where it's warmer, and it could take longer. But what we're looking for is a really thick layer of mold across the whole top of the surface. So I'll be bringing you back to show an example of that. If you go too long, the seeds can actually start to germinate in the container. So you don't want to go too long. But if, on the other hand, if you take it too soon, when it hasn't had enough time to mold, that gelatinous sac will not be broken down yet. So it's a very fine line. So I'll be sure to show you examples of that in my shed when we get to that point. If you're into tomato breeding, I do want to talk a little bit about when you want to start separating for different strains of your varieties. If you zoom in here, these 3 red containers are all from an F3 tomato that I grew. Now you can see that clearly we have 3 different strains here. So I separated them, and I'm going to name them differently so that when I grow these next year, I'm going to be saving these F4 seeds and growing out the F4 plants next year. So we can select and see if they will continue to display these same characteristics. So just to show you an example, we have a round red cherry, which of the 3, I thought this had the best flavor. We also have a more egg-shaped, elongated cherry. And then we also have a miniature pear-shaped. So this is all from the same cross, and these were all F3 fruits that I grew out this year, but quite a marked difference in characteristics and flavor. So you can see for now I'm just naming them an F4 egg shape. This will be the F4 round shape, and of course the F4 pear shape. So this will be very exciting to grow out next year and see how it's coming along. Let's take a look at some fermented seeds and how they're coming along. First, I want to show an example of where it's gone too long. So you can see here that it's pretty dried up and there's not much liquid in there anymore, as well as this example. It'll be fine as long as they haven't germinated, but preferably you would not go that far with it. This one is also pretty far along. Now, as another example, this one here, as well as this one, are not far enough along, so they need to ferment longer. And this one is a pretty ideal example right here. I would say also this one. Okay, so here's a batch of tomato seeds that I have been fermenting for 1 week. This is October 2nd, and in September we did have a freeze, so my garden has officially frozen. So, although I let these sit for a week, it will vary based on your humidity and temperature in your area. And since it's later in the year, and it is October 2nd now, it did take a week. I probably could have taken these out sooner, but this looks pretty good. Let's zoom in and look at that nice layer of mold on these containers. If you go too long, the seeds will actually germinate, which is not good. Also, if you go too long, sometimes, I know this is gross, but yes, you'll get maggots in the containers as well. So it's kind of a fine line. You do need to come and check on them. So let's get started with the washing process. Okay, so we're outside ready to wash our fermented seeds. Materials you need, you're going to need some cold water with an outside water spigot. So I just have a hose and a sprayer set up here. Some extra containers. You're going to need a strainer. This is just a cheap one that I bought for seed saving, so I would not use this for food use. It is designated just for this purpose. Also, you're going to need some plates. Now you want a non-stick surface, so something like a ceramic plate or a plastic plate like this, that when the seeds are drying, they won't stick to it. So don't use newspaper, paper towels, or anything like that. This would be a ceramic plate here. So now we're ready to start washing. What I tend to do is I don't have quite big enough containers. I'm being frugal and I'm using leftover food containers, but they're really not big enough by themselves. So I'm going to be using a second container. Just make sure that there's no remaining seeds from a previous use, so we do not get the varieties mixed up. Now both of these containers are the same variety, so there will be no confusion. But remember, I have my labels where I have the masking tape label on the container, which I will be peeling off and placing onto my drying plate. If you had a large enough container, you could take your water spray and vigorously spray it on here to break this up. But because my container is too small, I need to dump it into another container. So I'm going to go ahead and pour that. Now I'm going to add a vigorous spray of cold water to each container. We will give this a few seconds for it to settle. Sometimes you may need to use a stick to stir it with. For example, in this one where the layer of mold is rather thick and lumpy here. So I'm just going to give it a little vigorous stir to kind of break that up. You may or may not need to do this, but I've been fermenting these seeds for a solid week. So we do have a rather vigorous layer of mold. By giving this a few seconds, what will happen is the good seeds will settle to the bottom, and the mold and non-viable seeds will float to the top. So we're going to begin by gradually pouring off the tops of these containers. Now this one here didn't have that many seeds in it. I'll be combining them in a second. A very small amount there. Now just very slowly pour this off. If you go too fast, you may lose some of the seeds. As you can see, I'm losing some of them there. So let's add more water. Give that a chance to settle. The larger the container you have, the easier this is going to be. But again, I'm just reusing old food containers. Okay, I'm not going to pour all of it out. We're going to just keep adding water. You can see all that mold on the top. We're going to let that settle. I'm going to go ahead and combine these. Again, we're going to pour the top off. You can see that we're starting to get to the good viable seeds here on the bottom now. Definitely making some progress. There's no need to stir it at this point. You can just see everything sinking to the bottom. Okay, we're getting close. Do this as many times as you need to get the mold off. And get the seeds nice and clean. This looks good, so now we're ready to place it through the strainer. Usually you can't get it in one pour, so we'll fill it again here. I want to make sure that I get all of the seeds out of the container. There's one stray one there. Okay, the container is empty. And now I do like to wash the seeds one final time. So I'm just going to take my garden hose here and rinse them off with the cold water. Give it a little shake. And now we're ready to put this on our drying plate. So here I've got my plastic plate. And it works really nice if you just go really fast and tip it over in one sweep. Like that. Check your strainer to make sure if you missed any seeds. I see 2 here. So we don't want to have any stray seeds that would get intermixed with my next batch. Okay, so the strainer is clean. And next what I do is I take that masking tape label that I made off of my container. I can now peel that off and place it right onto the plate. And now we have a nice label. Now you do want to use your fingers to spread this out for drying purposes. You don't want to leave it in one big clump or it'll take forever to dry. So spread this out. And we'll come back and check on this tomorrow. Make sure you get any stray seeds that are stuck on your fingers off. And this one is ready to go. Begin by giving a full blast of water to break up this moldy top layer. Now in this example, the container was a little too small, so I'm going to be transferring it to another container. I'm going to transfer it back to the other one. And then we're going to break it into halves here. Add additional water. My cat is curious as to what we're up to today. Now the viable seeds will sink to the bottom, and all the mold and non-viable seeds will float to the surface. So next we're going to dump this out. And now you can start to see some seeds here. So stop, add more water. And again, the viable seeds are sinking to the bottom. So go ahead and pour that out. Add more water. And continue to add water and pour off the top. You can see all that debris floating in there. It's not so much the mold anymore, but it looks more like the gelatinous sac that encases the seeds. So this is just showing that the fermentation process was effective at removing that. Again, let those seeds sink to the bottom. And now we're going to run this through the strainer. So now that the seeds are in the strainer, we're going to give it one additional rinse. And with one firm action here, we're going to tap this onto the plate. And now we can spread out the seeds for drying. Next, I'll be removing my label from the container and placing it onto the plate. Remember, I had used masking tape, which it easily peels off and can now be placed onto your drying surface. This one happens to be one of my breeding projects that is at the F7 stage. Now as this begins to dry, you'll want to come periodically and use your fingers to break up the clumps. Now this was the same variety, but I had split it in half, so we can continue with this one. Don't really want my pets to be eating the moldy food. The next step after washing your tomatoes is drying them. I take all of my plates and I dry them in the floor of my basement in my utility area. If you lived in a warmer climate, you could probably do it outside. One thing you can do to speed up the drying process is use a small fan like this and just point it onto the seeds to speed up the drying. But honestly, tomatoes dry pretty fast, so you don't really need to do that. So next thing I want to do is zoom in and look closely at these seeds. Again, it's important to use a non-stick plate or ceramic. These are plastic. And you'll see when they dry that they are very clumpy. So we need to go in here and break up the clumps so that they look more like this one, where they're all separated and individualized. So to break up the clumps, you just simply grab your fingers and you're going to roll the clumps in between your fingertips, and you can see that they easily break right up. We want to make sure that they're 100% dry, and so that's why we want to have them separated into individual seeds and not in clumps like this. With squash seeds, it is a little bit easier to test when they are adequately dry, because with squash, you can take that seed and break it in half to test the dryness. With tomato seeds, they're small and you can't do that trick. But visually, you can usually see that they're dry, and they do dry pretty rapidly. So go ahead and finish the whole plate, rolling all these in between your fingers. And this plate is ready to continue drying. Some tips for storing tomato seeds. Basically, moisture is the enemy. You want to make sure that your seeds are very dry and preferably in a cool and dark place. I do like to use these plastic resealable bags. I'll have a link in the description for these, but basically they're just small bags with a Ziploc type seal on the top. They come in different sizes. I do have some smaller ones as an example here. You can see these two varieties. I kind of prefer the bigger ones because I can use them for other things in addition to tomatoes. And all you need to do is take a permanent marker and write the variety name and the year that you collected and saved the seeds. Viability of tomato seeds is generally about 4 to 10 years. I have successfully germinated varieties that were over a decade old. The thing to keep in mind is the older the seeds are, the germination rate will decline along with that. I hope that I've encouraged you to save your own tomato seeds. This is one of my absolute favorite activities. I love tomatoes, obviously everything about it, from growing them, breeding them, saving the seeds, and obviously eating them. So another great thing is tomatoes are annuals. So every year you get a fresh start. Every spring I get to take out these packets of seeds that I've worked so hard to save, and I get to start them anew every year. Even though the season has ended for me right now, I'm already super excited and already thinking about how I want to do it next year, changes I want to make, lessons that I've learned, varieties that did or didn't do well. It's just so awesome. So I really encourage you to get started on tomato seed saving and watch my other videos about tomatoes as well. Thanks for watching. In addition to the seed saving bags, I highly recommend the book Seed to Seed by Suzanne Ashworth. It tells you how to save seed of 160 vegetables. The cover is missing on mine because I had a Great Dane and he chewed the cover off of it. I'll have a link in the description. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and happy seed saving.